is everyone today? Good, good. All right, we're about to take a crash course in the book of Esther. 9 chapters in 30 minutes. So we'll see. Oh, before I start, you're probably wondering where Richard is. He is visiting his daughter Caroline because she is about to have a baby. She was supposed to be induced this morning, but apparently there are no available beds. No room at the inn, as it were. So she is apparently like walking up and down the hallways trying to jog this thing, get this thing moving. So just be praying for her and safe delivery and all the rest of that. So that's what's going on with Richard at the moment. So last week, the last number of weeks, Richard has been doing a series about the Hebrews, or the heroes of Hebrews. And so I thought I would continue on with that. And I'm actually going to do a condensed lesson from what I taught at Falls Creek with the youth here a couple of weeks back. And we're going to look at the book of Esther and the character of Esther. Last week, Richard could not have set me up for this particular sermon any better. And I don't think it was intentional. So I've got to think that maybe God was doing something there. But last week, if you remember, if you were here, Richard spoke mainly on 1 Samuel 15 and about Samuel and just Samuel's leadership and just how his interactions with Saul went. And part of the story that we read last week was about how Saul decided that he didn't want to listen to God's commands given through Samuel and basically sort of halfway obeyed God. And I think one of Richard's main points was that kind of almost obedience is complete disobedience. And Saul's disobedience from last week comes back to bite them, or almost comes back to bite them in the story of Esther. So that's kind of how it really sets up, and I'm going to explain that to you guys in a second. We're going to get to that. So I've got a few main points that I'm going to kind of highlight. They're in the back of your bulletin that you can look at and take notes if you want to. But I read this quote earlier this week, and it kind of stuck out to me. It says, "Sin will make fools of us all, but in the process, make us think that we're smarter than God." And I read that and I was like, oh, wow, I got to read that again. That's good. Sin will make fools of us all, and in the process make us think that we're smarter than God, which ultimately is what makes fools of us, because we decide to disregard his commands like we know better. And that's exactly what Saul did. He was commanded, however much heartburn it gives our 21st century minds, to kill all the Amalekites, men, women, and children, and animals. Because children become adults. And Saul decided, okay, we'll do most of this, but I'm going to keep King Agag alive. Probably partly for sport, partly to show off, partly to brag. Whatever reason it was, he disobeyed. And ultimately, Samuel had to finish the job that Saul was supposed to do. Saul's disobedience comes back years later in the year 486 BC to begin to bite back the Israelites and the Jews. Okay, so 486 BC, during the reign of King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes I, Israel find themselves having been exiled for disobedience again. They're exiled to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, who later is conquered by Cyrus the Great of the Medo-Persian Empire. And Cyrus, during this time, issues a decree that all the exiled people, including Israel, are allowed to return home, which many of them do, but some stay. And so this Medo-Persian Empire is full of all of these peoples who have been brought there in captivity, some of which have returned home, but some who have been there long enough, they feel like they fit, it's their home now, and they decide to stay where they are. Cyrus issues this decree, and people return home. Many others, though, as I say, chose to stay. The incredible story of Esther unfolds as she ascends to the throne of the Persian Empire as queen alongside King Xerxes I, and she finds herself in the precarious position of having to put her life on the line in order to save her people from a genocidal maniac named Haman. Hope you're getting all the main characters here, because we're going to blow through this thing fast, okay? All right? Haman has risen to prominence in the Persian Empire. We're not entirely told why, but he rises to a place of prominence, and he is using that newfound power to destroy initially Esther's cousin Mordecai, but by extension, the entire Israelite people in the Persian Empire. That's the story in a nutshell. All right, and you're probably thinking, how does this relate to 1 Samuel 15? I'll get to that. Okay? I say we're going to hit some of the highlights. I'm going to attempt to do it justice in about 30 minutes or so as we retell the story, but also unpack some of the theological themes that are woven throughout the whole story. So if you have the book of Esther open, if you don't, go ahead and open it. We're not going to read it because we haven't got time to read 9 whole chapters, which I wish we did. I'm going to summarize some parts. I'm going to refer to some parts. I'm just going to tell you the story on some parts. And then there may be some verses here and there that we read just to highlight some of the important stuff going on, okay? So buckle up and hang on, all right? So my 3 main points that we're going to look at, calling the first one, the mastermind of malice. And this is about Haman, okay? Then there's the cacophony of coincidence, or coinkydinks. And then there's the pendulum of providence. Okay, so we got all sorts of alliteration going on. Help you remember that, and we'll go from there. So we'll start off with the mastermind of malice. See if my slides here. He is looking evil. He's probably a little too good looking to be considered evil, but imagine that's Haman, okay? All right? He thinks he's the mastermind. So I mentioned there was a connection to 1 Samuel 15 from last week's. So if you look at chapter 3, we'll come back to chapters 1 and 2, but we're going to start at chapter 3 and look at verse 1. Our residential genocidal maniac is introduced to the story. Saul has left King Agag alive. We're not told for how long. There's a lot of times when you read scripture, stuff happens in one chapter and it seems like it's all in the same day, but sometimes it can be a whole process going on in there, okay? So we're not told for how long King Agag is left alive, but the implication from what we read here is that in the process, some of his immediate descendants are either left alive or he's allowed to have a child that then is scurried away, okay? So look at chapter 3, verse 1. It says, after these events, which we'll talk about those events in a little bit, King Xerxes, for whatever reason, honors Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. The first 4 letters of that, Agag. Haman, our evil genocidal maniac, is a direct descendant of King Agag. If Saul had done what he was supposed to do, the book of Esther never comes about. We don't need it. Okay? This genocide that Haman is attempting to undertake never happens because he's not in existence. If Saul had done what he was told, if he had trusted that God knew what was coming and foresaw what was coming down in the future and done what he was told and obeyed, none of this comes about. Now, as a result of that, we would miss a really cool story about God's hand working. So there's an upside to that, but the reality is this whole story of Esther and this scary prospect that they are facing happens because of Saul's disobedience. Saul's disobedience has huge ramifications that ripple throughout history. And in many ways, ours do too. Maybe not on quite the same level, but it does ripple through our families and our generations to come as we decide whether or not we're going to trust God or not and follow through properly, okay? So Haman is the Agagite. He's a direct descendant of King Agag, and Haman fancies himself a master manipulator, a mastermind of malice, if you will. He's a manipulator of politics and of people as he maneuvers himself into a position of power so that he can act his evil plot against Mordecai and the Jews. If you were watching a movie, this is where the evil, ominous music kicks in. All right? Haman comes on the scene. It would seem, in part at least, for Haman, the trigger for his rage against the Jewish people starts with Mordecai's refusal to bow down to him. As the king has honored him, everyone bows to Haman. Mordecai refuses to. Partly probably because he's a man of God and he wants to worship God alone, but partly, he maybe understands who Haman is and what the backstory is. But whatever it is, Mordecai will not bow the knee to Haman, and Haman is triggered. When Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, he's even more triggered, and his plot comes into fruition. It starts becoming more than just an idea, and he starts enacting this plot to not just take out Mordecai, but to take out all of his people with him. Haman is enraged. Two things happen in the rest of chapter 3 that I want to just highlight. We're going to kind of breeze through some of this. First off, Haman is so determined to follow through on this plot, this plan. Before he even starts enacting the plan, he wants to decide when the plan is going to happen. Okay? And based upon what we know of the time and the place and of Haman, it says that he cast lots, which at the time were called the pur. Okay? P-U-R. And he cast lots to randomly decide when his genocide was going to take place. It gives you an insight into the mind of Haman a little bit, that he's one who relies on chance and on random events. He sees the world as a whole series of random events that he can manipulate and control to his ends. He throws the pur, and the pur come back with the last month of the year is when his genocide is going to take place. This happens in like the first month of the year, so there's like an 11-month process, which for a genocidal maniac is probably not the optimal result he was looking for. But at least it gives him some time to plan, but it also gives time for God to work. The second thing we see is after he's cast a pur and he's decided upon a date, then he goes to work, and he goes to work on the king, trying to convince the king to follow along with his plan. Look at verse 8 of chapter 3. It says, "Then Haman said to King Xerxes, 'There is a certain people who will remain nameless.'" I'm not going to tell you who they are. We're just going to keep it all very general. All right? And at this point, the king does not know that Esther is a Jew. That has all been kept hidden. It's all under wraps at this point, okay? But he says to King Xerxes, "There's a certain people that are dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws," which is probably not entirely accurate. There's probably a semblance of truth to that, because they had their own ways and they served their God. And he says, "It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." And then he offers to pay for the extermination, as he requests that a decree be issued for their destruction. The king is probably more insulted by the fact that Haman has offered to pay, that he's not paying attention to what he's actually really being asked to do. As she says, don't you worry about money. It's no object. I'm the King Xerxes. I have all this power, wealth. You hold on to your money. Here's just my signet ring. You go do what you want to do. And the plot begins. Things start going into a thing, and things start moving pretty fast. Haman uses the signet ring and the authority that comes with it to issue a decree that on the 12th month, the 13th day of the 12th month, the Israelites, the Jews, are fair game. And anyone who wants to go take their property and kill them in the process is authorized to do so. And this decree goes out to all the provinces. And the province of Susa, which is largely where the Jews congregated and lived, it says that they were bewildered, I think is the word that is actually used, at least in the NIV, but I think probably freaked out is probably a better term for that. There are plenty of other examples of Haman's manipulation and his attempts to mastermind his plot, and we'll look at some of them in a little bit later on with context of other things, so I'm not going to spend too long because I've only got 30 minutes or so. But that gives you a brief taste and a brief idea of who this Haman character is and how he fancied himself as this mastermind of evil and of malice, this plot that he's going to come about to get rid of this guy just that he didn't even really know before, just who refused to bow to him. And as a result, I'm going to take out his people as well once he finds out that he's a Jew. There's no doubt that the scriptures list the fact that he's an Agagite, and the connection to 1 Samuel, that this is part of his motivation to do this and enact this horrible scheme of his. But he enacts this thing and acts as if he is the one that is in control. He sees himself as a mastermind. He sees the people around him, including the king, as mere pawns in his game. But there were two realities that he failed to recognize. The first is that his anger is actually controlling him rather than him being in control. So he's not in control just for that reason alone. You know, Elise and I used to often say to our kids when they were younger, and I'm sure you guys have uttered the same thing, don't let your emotions control you, you control them. Okay? We are living in a world that is increasingly, where people are increasingly triggered, is a buzzword nowadays. And all it basically means is that they are not in control. Their emotions control them. And the littlest thing, from politics to someone looking sideways at them or something that somebody says, will trigger them, and they have a physiological response as a result that then oftentimes turns into some sort of an action. So Haman is in this position where he thinks he's in control, but he can't even control his own emotions. His emotions are controlling him. And this triggering ultimately leads to his downfall, as God kind of turns it on itself. The second, and perhaps more obvious thing to us rather than to him, was that ultimately God was the one who was truly in control and was 100 steps ahead of him, even though he didn't realize it. Control is an illusion for all of us. We are not in control. This life is both transitory and fragile, as we saw yesterday even, okay? And we are not in control, and we never have been. But the good news is that we serve a God who is, and always has been, and always will be. We serve a God who is sovereign, and there is great comfort and peace for us to find in that truth and in that knowledge. And the more we know of him and his love for us, the more we can be able to trust him and relinquish our need for control, even if our attentions aren't as dastardly as Senor Haman's. Okay? So, those little, just a real little snippet right there, that's the whole thing. That's who Haman saw himself as. That gives you a little bit of the context of this whole book as well. The book is written to make it seem like Haman is pulling all the strings. And it makes it seem like Esther and Mordecai have no control of the situation, which they don't, right? And the comments about Susa being bewildered, this province of Susa being bewildered, all play into this idea that Haman is in control. But he's not. He just hasn't figured it out yet. He's about to. All right? So the second point I have is called the cacophony of coincidence. Now, the word cacophony is often used with relation to kind of sounds just all piling on top of one another and just this dissonant sound coming across. But it also just can be used in this whole idea of just a lot going on at once. Okay, and so buckle up now. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open it, chapter 1. And I'm going to just refer to a whole lot of stuff within the book of Esther that at first glance just appears as mere coincidence. But there's something else going on behind the scenes. One of the fascinating things about the book of Esther is that it's the only book of the Bible where God is never mentioned. And the crazy thing is you can read the whole thing and read the story and see the redemption or the deliverance of God's people, and you can be convinced that you've been reading God's name throughout the whole thing. Because his fingerprints are all over it, but he's never mentioned. Oftentimes there's a few hints, but there's no ever outright suggestions that God is involved in any of it. When I was a freshman in college, I just moved to the States from Ireland. I took English 1 at a professor called Gary Gwynn. And one of my first assignments for the class was to write an essay describing a feeling or an emotion without stating what that feeling or emotion was. So I had to describe it in such a way that it was so well done that he knew exactly what I was talking about without me ever actually talking about it. So bright spark that I am, I think, I'm a million miles away from home. I'm going to write about being homesick. I can totally relate to that right now. This should be really easy to kind of conjure up and stuff. And so I wrote this essay about being homesick. I wrote about missing my parents and my family. I wrote about things in Ireland that were different from things in the States. I talked about my culture shock that I was struggling with and dealing with and all the rest of that. Never mentioned the word homesick. And my professor guessed right off the bat what it was I was talking about, and I got an A. And I thought, awesome. First English assignment. And then I was deathly homesick for about 2 straight weeks. Because I connected with all those emotions. I'm like, oh, that was a bad idea. Should have picked something that was completely off and not related to me. In many ways, the book of Esther has done exactly the same thing. It has masterfully woven through a series of what appear random events and circumstances, statements, timing of things, apparent coincidences that culminate in the rescuing of God's people without ever mentioning God's name, but he's the central figure throughout the entire book. And you can't miss it. It's impossible to miss. And it's written that way on purpose. Esther is in many ways seen as the hero, which she is. But there's someone behind the hero that is getting her to where she needs to be. So I say, buckle up. We're going to run right through. So if you go to chapter 1, and we're going to try to hit this real fast. Okay, go to chapter 1, and it starts off in chapter 1, gives you a little bit of historical context, and then it talks about Xerxes throwing this party for 6 months. They had a 6-month-long party. And the whole point of the party was to celebrate King Xerxes, his power, his wealth, and the size of his kingdom. It was a bragging party. And the wine flowed. There was no expense spared. They threw everything at it. And the whole kingdom celebrated in this thing. All right? After the 6-month-long party, there was a 1-week intensive party, as if the 6 months was not enough. And it mentions yet again that the wine flowed freely. In other words, they were all drunk as skunks. Okay? And there was a men's party, and there was a women's party. Queen Vashti, who was King Xerxes' queen, was in charge of the women's party, and Xerxes and his nobles were in charge of the men's party. And as drunk men are apt to do, and this all just appears as complete coincidence, as drunk men are apt to do, they decide, you know what, let's bring a beautiful woman in here. Xerxes, summon your queen and bring her before us so that we can marvel at her beauty. Well, so Vashti is summoned, and she's like, what? Number one, I'm running my own party. And number two, you want me to go parade myself in front of a bunch of drunk nobles? No, I'm not going. Now, you don't say no to the king. And again, this is what part of these coincidences, but it's setting up the story for later on. Vashti refuses to go. The king is embarrassed in front of all of his nobles, and he said, what should I do? And they said, well, you know what? If Vashti is going to buck the system, if we're not careful, all of our wives will buck the system, and we're in trouble. You better put her in her place so that you can keep all of our wives straight. And so he issues a decree, and they take pains to note that the decrees cannot be undone. Once it's issued, signed with the signet ring, it is law. You can't go back. You can't issue a decree undoing the decree. It's a done deal. And the decree he issues is that Vashti will never before come before his presence, and she is stripped of her crown and her title. She's no longer queen. Coincidence? I think not. God is setting the stage. Because after Vashti is deposed, a new queen is now needed. So shortly after that, it talks about how the king realizes what he's done when he sobers up, but he can't undo it. And so they suggest to him, you need to have a beauty contest in all of the kingdom and find some nice young maiden that you're pleased with, and she will become your new queen. Well, lo and behold, Esther is one of the women who are dragged into the harem to get beautified, and there's a year-long set of beauty treatments. 2 sets of 6 months of various things here and there to beautify these women before they go before the king. to have their one night with him to convince him that they're the one that he should choose. It talks about how Esther gained favor with the head servant that was in charge of the beauty treatments, with the other women that she was with, and ultimately with King Xerxes. And she is chosen to become queen. And again, it's all just written as if this just happened to happen. So Queen Esther is now queen over the entire kingdom of Persia and has a lot of power that comes with that, but is still second to the king and down the pecking order, but she's in position. God is moving his chess pieces. And in this game of chess, she's the queen, in case you hadn't figured that out or wondered about that. Okay, so then as a complete side note in chapter 2, it just casually mentions in a few verses that Mordecai used to sit at the front gate. He happened to overhear a couple of the guys plotting the assassination of the king, reports it, it gets thwarted, and then Esther makes sure that it gets written in the book of annals for the king to read later on, or someone to read later on. They kept track of everything, apparently. Very, very side note put in there, all right? Timing is everything, and God's got it in spades. So Haman doesn't get introduced until chapter 3. Okay, so Haman, who thinks himself as this mastermind, is coming in almost in the middle of the story. God's already been at work for 2 whole chapters. And there's about 8 years that have gone on in that process. So Haman thinks he's the mastermind. He doesn't know what he's up against. Haman comes in chapter 3. We've talked about some of this already. He gets introduced. He's being honored by the king, so he's moving up the ladder. He's triggered by Mordecai that initiates the plot to kill both Mordecai and the Jews. And later on, it kind of helps essentially to dig his own grave. His overreaction causes him to overreach, and God uses it. It's like classic, like karate or ninja. You use the opponent's movement to your advantage. You step out of the way and pull them this way or whatever else. God is totally playing that game with him. In chapter 4, the line of the book, as Mordecai challenges Esther to use her position to stick her neck out for her people. This is like probably the most famous line in the book. As he's trying to convince her to go before the king because this decree has been issued and everyone's freaking out. Mordecai is in sackcloth and ashes, and he says to Esther, you need to go plead our case before the king. And she says, I can't. You don't just go into the king unannounced. If I do that, I'm likely to be killed. The only possible reprieve is if the king decides to extend grace and extend his scepter and allow me to live. But if I just go in unannounced, it's not likely to end well. And Mordecai convinces her, he says, look, God has put you in this position, although he never uses the name of God, he never says it directly. And here's what he says, who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. This is like the critical or the perfect line in the middle of, and again, with scripture, I love it. It's right in the middle of the book. It's pivotal, right? It's designed that way. A Hebrews reading this would have read it right in the middle and gone, boom, that's key. That's right. This is turning here on this. She decides that he's right. She agrees with him, and she asks for 3 days of fasting for her people and his people before she makes her move. And at this point, you get the sense that she really hasn't decided how she's going to do this. She's just winging it. Chapter 5, she goes before the king, who thankfully for her, or coincidentally, extends his scepter and allows her to live. And he says, up to half my kingdom, what is your request? I'll give it to you. For whatever reason, Esther, rather than jumping straight in and asking for him to save her from this whole plot or whatever else, she says, let's just have dinner, you, me, and Haman later on today. And he's like, okay, that seems like a pretty minimal request. We can do that. So they go to do that. They have dinner. At dinner, he asks again, what is your request? And for whatever reason, it doesn't tell you why, but you got this sense that a gut instinct is telling her, or the Holy Spirit is telling her, not yet. Hold up on the request just a little bit longer. So she asks for dinner the next day. Same thing. You, me, and Haman, just the 3 of us, dinner tomorrow. And the king's like, fair enough, I can do that. And so the banquet is prepared. In the meantime, Haman is on cloud nine. He thinks his manipulations and his masterminding is working out better than he could ever have imagined. He just had dinner with the king and the queen. And so he goes home and he is bragging, family, friends, come on over, guys. I just had dinner with the king and queen. Everything is great. Except for on his way out the gate, who does he run into? But Mordecai. And he's triggered. But he puts it aside. He's not going to let Mordecai spoil this moment. He goes home. He tells about all that's happened. And he says, yeah, but there's this one, I can't shake it. This guy is sitting there, just grating on me. And they're like, you know what you should do? They're like, what should I do? You need to erect like a 75-foot pole in the backyard, and you can either hang or impale him on it, depending on what it was they did. Depending on your translation, it's one or the other. And he's like, that's a great idea. Make it happen. All right? Next day, dinner comes around. Actually, before next day, something coincidental happens. And this is where things really start to turn. Later that night, late at night, sounds like me last night, messaging with my niece who was trying to get back to Ireland. And she had like an 8-hour delay at the Texarkana airport because there was a punctured tire on the plane. And they took forever to get the repair crew in to fix that. She finally got to Dallas, and instead of going straight Dallas to Dublin, because she'd missed that connection, there's only one per day, they're sending her to Charlotte, North Carolina, and then to Dallas. She'll arrive at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning. She had a 5 a.m. flight this morning from Dallas to Charlotte. And so I'm just messaging with her half the night, just making sure she's okay, and that she's making flights, and she's landing, and she's figuring out what terminal to get. She landed in, I think it was Dallas last night, and she says, okay, so how do I get to Terminal A? And I'm like, I don't know. Isn't there like a train or tram or something that you take? She's like, yeah, it's called the Skylink, which is funny because her name is Sky. She said, but it's not running right now. I'm like, well, it makes sense. It's like midnight. So she's like, so how do I get there? I'm like, if your flight's at 5 a.m., will it have turned on before 5 a.m.? I don't know. You might need to take a shuttle. Ask someone. But we spent half the night just texting back and forth with this stuff. Right? Similar sort of thing is going on with this here. It just says at the beginning of chapter 6, the king was unable to sleep that particular night. Seems like total random, total coincidence. And then the king does what he normally does when he can't sleep. And he asks someone to come in and read him from the book of the Annals. The most boring book on the planet. Because all it does is just detail everything that happened every day. And they just picked random days or would just read stuff until he fell asleep. Because there's just nothing interesting going on. Well, it just so happens, nothing just so happens, right? But they read from the chapter in the book or a page in the book that details the assassination plot that Mordecai uncovered 8 years prior that saved the king. And the king's response is like, whoa, hold on a minute. That's not boring. I'm not falling asleep here. I'm actually more awake now than I was before. What did we do for this guy? And he's like, there's nothing written in here. He's like, okay, so we didn't do anything? He said, no, we didn't do anything. He's like, we need to fix that right now. Well, it just so happens Haman can't sleep either. Totally different reason, but the same person in mind. Both of them had Mordecai on the mind. The king, because he wants to honor him, because he saved his life. Haman, because he can't wait to kill him. He's got this pole being set up in his backyard, and he's going to convince the king to let him get on with it rather than waiting till all the way in December. Okay? And so he's hoping that as daylight comes up, as daybreak comes along, that he'll have an opportunity to get in the king's ear and convince him of this thing. Well, before daybreak even happens, the king is so ready to honor Mordecai, he turns to his servant. He says, who's out in the courts? Is there anyone out in the courtyard out there going on? He said, oh, well, Haman just showed up. And Haman's like just itching, ready to go. Come on, daylight, let's go. What time? Okay, it's only 3 o'clock in the morning. We got time to wait. Servant, he says, go get him. So the servant goes out and drags Haman and says, hey, come talk to the king. And Haman's like, oh my gosh, this is happening. I'm better than I thought. Okay, he gets up to the king and says, yes, king, how can I help you? And the king says, look, I've got this guy who has done this great thing for me. and I forgot to honor him, and I want to. Haman thinks this is all about him. And so the king says, what should I do to honor this man? So Haman comes up with this elaborate thing of marching through the city, parade him on a horse, put one of the nobles out in front and just brag on this guy, take him through the whole province and, just go after it. King says, that's a great idea. Go do that for Mordecai. And he's like, wait, what? You want me? And so Haman has to spend all the next day parading Mordecai on a horse through the kingdom, bragging on him because Mordecai saved the king, and this is the man that the king desires to honor. And Haman is dying inside. And he goes home after a long day of doing this. He's tired, he's exhausted, he's frustrated. His plan has started to unravel. He doesn't know what to do. He talks about it with his family and just moans and groans. And they're like, man, Mordecai's too powerful now. God, the king has raised him up. You can't go after him now. You got to bide your time. You got to figure this thing out. While they're still talking about it, the king's servants show up. Hey, Haman, it's time for dinner with the queen and the king. And so he doesn't even have time to clear his mind, and off he's whisked to the palace for the second banquet with the queen and king. They arrive at the banquet, and the king says, okay, what is your request? Haman is so preoccupied with everything that's going wrong in his life, he's probably not really paying that much attention. And Esther then turns, she says, this is her moment. She doesn't know what's going on with that. She has no idea, probably. Maybe she's heard about Mordecai being honored, but oftentimes the palace was insulated. She didn't seem to know that the decree against the Jews was issued in the first place, because she was insulated from that being in the palace. All that happened outside. So she may not even know, but she decides she's going to take her chance. This is her thing. In chapter 4 with Mordecai, she says, if I perish, I perish, but I'm going to go do the right thing. I'm going to step up here. And so she, probably with her heart in her mouth, tongue dry, sticking to the roof of her mouth, she says, here's what I request, O king. She says, I ask that you spare me, spare my life. And the king's like, what are you talking about? He's like, and the life of my people. And the king's like, I still don't know what you're talking about. And so she reveals to him that she's a Jew. And she reveals to him the plot that he's already signed off on with Haman to exterminate her people. And when the king realizes that Haman has plotted against his own queen, he loses it. He is angry. He's so angry, and he's realized that he's had a part in it. He gets up and leaves the room. Again, the timing of it all and the quote-unquote coincidence of it all is just incredible. He is out in the room trying to clear his head. Meanwhile, in the other room where Esther is, Haman starts recognizing what's going on, and he's realized he is in big trouble. So he is begging for his life. And as a result, he's kind of like all over Queen Esther, just going, no, don't do it, save me, whatever else. The king walks back in, and he's practically on top of her, misinterprets it all, and he's done. And then right at that moment, coincidentally, a servant arrives and said, Your Honor, Your Majesty, we just noticed there's a big giant pole just got erected up in the backyard of Haman. And the king's like, great, use it. String him up. And Haman's like, what the whole thing is just not just unraveled in his face and in the course of like 24 hours or like maybe 48, but now he's getting impaled on the same pole that he had set up for Mordecai. And everything just flips on its head. He thought he was the mastermind. God was. It looks like it's all just coincidence because God is never mentioned, but God's fingerprints are absolutely all over it. The story of Esther is an amazing reminder that the God we serve is sovereign. He's in control over all of his creation and everything that happens within it. Ephesians 1:11 says that in him we have been chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will. In other words, our Lord works out everything in agreement with the purposes of his will or his desires. God is in control. And in many ways, the book of Esther deliberately makes it look like God is not present. It makes it look like Haman is in control. It makes it seem like God is invisible and uninterested and all the rest of that sort of thing until the last minute when it all twists. To help us connect with that feeling. Because I don't know about you, but I have oftentimes felt that it seems like God is checked out. Sometimes circumstances in our life serve to make us feel like God is not aware of our circumstances. And at the very least, he's not involved. He's not engaged. But that could not be further from the truth. And the book of Esther proves to us and shows us that even when it looks like God is not watching, not available, he's been working long before the need even arises. My wife oftentimes bugs the life out of me when it comes to finances, because sometimes it'll feel like we're just getting ahead financially, and then we have a car repair. And I always get frustrated. I'm like, oh my gosh, we just had a little bit saved up in the bank. We were just having a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of comfort. I was feeling good. We had this money. I was actually beginning to think about how I could spend it, and then bam, it's gone. And I would see it as a negative, as a frustration. And she would say, well, maybe God knew that we were going to need that. And so he built up the reserves so that we would have it when we needed it. And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right. God is in control, and God is at work. Part of the brilliance of the book of Esther is that even though he's never spoken of or referred to or seen, Haman didn't see him and thought he was the mastermind, but was outplayed before he even started. Mordecai and Esther didn't see him either. And the despair of the people of Susa during the whole thing going on, Mordecai, as he rips his clothes and puts on the sackcloth and ashes, as the news of Haman's decree sinks in. Esther's fear as she's on the other side of that door about to go in and see the king and what's going to happen. The feeling of being out of control, but all the time, God's invisible hand was at work. Faith is risk. If faith is about believing in what is unseen, being certain of what we do not see, trusting that God is going to be our safety net and come to our aid as we need it to. And it swings really nicely into my last point that I'll do real quickly here. But the pendulum of providence is seen throughout. The great reversal after chapter 7 shows this pendulum swing and how quickly it happens. God's providence is described as the miraculous way that God weaves events together behind the scenes so that his sovereignty over his world is carried out. Or it could be equally, maybe more personally read as the miraculous way in which God weaves events behind the scenes so that his sovereignty over my life, your life, our lives, and our world is carried out. I often remind my students that God knows what he's doing, and that sometimes things are too coincidental to be a coincidence. Sometimes I need to remind my students that God knows what he's doing, but I think sometimes the more pressing question that we often ask ourselves is he doing anything at all? And the emphatic answer is yes, he is. Esther speaks to that. Chapter 8 and 9 show the pendulum swing of God's providence. There are 5 main reversals. The financial reversal, Haman's estate is given to Esther. The political reversal, Mordecai is giving the signet ring that Haman no longer requires. There's the legal reversal. They get to, under the authority of the king and with the signet ring, issue a decree that allows the Jews to defend themselves when the time comes on that 13th day of the 12th month. There's the emotional reversal, just the mood swing from the bewilderment of Susa, the freak out, and the sackcloth and ashes to joy and their sorrow turning into dancing. And then ultimately, there's the spiritual reversal. In the very end of chapter 8, I think it is, it says, verse 17 of chapter 8, it says that many people of other nationalities became Jews for fear of what God had done, or for fear of the Jews, essentially is what it says. But it's essentially this recognition that someone is working behind the scenes on their behalf, and they're more powerful than Haman and the king and circumstances themselves. And many people essentially got saved. They came into the kingdom. They followed the God of Israel rather than the gods that they had been serving with their own thing. So what are our takeaways? First one is that God is always working. Even when we can't see it, or as I said to the students, especially maybe when we can't see it, God is always working. God has been working. He will continue to work, both for our good and for his glory. Second thing is, for such a time of this, the most brilliant phrase in the book, God is moving his chess pieces around, of which we are some. And Mordecai says to Esther, maybe you have been put in the position that you're in for such a time as this. There are people that God has placed in your life, or you've been placed in their lives for who knows when that time is, but for a moment when you have an opportunity to point them to Christ, to share Christ with them, to lead them in the right direction, to pray for them, to come alongside them. For such a time, God is using and working his kingdom purposes through his kingdom people. Okay? Third thing is, there's no such thing as random in God's kingdom. Haman cast the lots to decide when he was going to enact his evil plan. The brilliant thing in chapter 9, I love this about God and how he works. The Israelites declared the 13th and 14th day of the last month as the Feast of Purim, which is a celebration of casting of lots, which they didn't believe in because they believed that God is sovereign. It's essentially, in many ways, a sarcastic nod that nothing is random in the kingdom of God. Nothing is random because we serve a God who is sovereign and is in control and is orchestrating things for our good and for his glory. Okay? Proverbs 16:3 says, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. It's a reminder to remember and celebrate God's goodness. And then the last one, but certainly not the least, it reminds me of the ultimate providential pendulum swing. Satan thought he was killing the Son of God on the cross. He thought this was the end. He thought he was winning. But God used it to save us and to bring us in relationship with him, to basically bring about our salvation and the salvation of all who would believe as a result. And we have an obligation to be used by God to spread that message and to pass that along to people that God has placed in our lives. I'll end with this real quick. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4 through 6 kind of speaks of this sovereignty of God. And you guys can come up to lead us in the last song as I read this. Ephesians 1, 4 through 6, it says, for he chose us before the creation of the world. In Esther, he started in chapter 1, and the danger didn't even appear until chapter 3. God started before the creation of the world. He chose us to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ, in accordance with his pleasure and his will, to the praise of his glorious grace, which he has freely given us in the one he loves. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavished upon us. With all wisdom and understanding, as a nod to his mastermind, he made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure, which he purposed in Christ, to be put in effect when the times reach their fulfillment, to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. Let's close in prayer real quick and then we'll worship. Lord, thank you for just the incredible way all of the pieces fell into place in this story. And Lord, thank you that you're the same God that is at work in our lives as you draw us to yourself and as you use us to draw those around us into relationship with you. Lord, I pray that we would become aware of your invisible hand, of your fingerprints at work in our lives. Help us, especially when we are feeling like you've checked out or you're not engaged or you're not aware. Help us to trust and remember this story and remember that you are engaged, you are aware, and you are always working. Help us to trust that and to act accordingly.